This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Yeah.
Today, we're going back to the 1930s.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how America went from, hardcore isolationism to being a major player in World War II. Our source this time is this history podcast for high school students. But trust me, it's got some really interesting stuff, even if you think you know this history pretty well already.
Yeah, I was surprised by some of what I learned.
Me too. Okay, so picture this. America in the 1930s. The Great Depression is hitting everyone hard. Memories of World War I are still super fresh and painful. And honestly, most Americans just want to stay out of any foreign conflicts, you know?
It was a real stay-in-our-lane kind of mood.
Exactly. Plus, the public was deeply scarred by World War I. There was a strong feeling that America had been tricked into getting involved in the First World War, and that it was all like some scheme for businesses to make a bunch of money.
Right.
And then you have the Nye Committee.
Oh, yeah, those guys.
They really dug into America's involvement in World War I.
Yeah.
And their investigations ended up fueling this huge distrust of any kind of foreign intervention.
Those findings from the Nye Committee were huge. I mean, explosive. They basically concluded that, American banks and arms manufacturers, they kind of pushed the U.S. into World War I for their own profit. Yeah. Can you imagine what that did to the American public? No wonder everyone was so isolationist.
Oh, total disillusionment. So with all that going on, it makes sense that Congress passed those Neutrality Acts in the mid-1930s, between 1935 and 1937.
Oh, absolutely.
These laws were basically designed to keep America out of any brewing conflicts, even if the president felt differently.
And that put President Roosevelt in a really tough spot. Think about it. He's getting all this intel about the growing threats in Europe and Asia, but he's totally stuck. He's got the Neutrality Acts tying his hands, and he's dealing with a really vocal isolationist Congress. Plus, he's got to keep the American people happy. I mean, they're still struggling to get through the Depression. It was, talk about a leadership challenge.
Yeah, how do you even begin to tackle that?
It makes you think about how leaders have to balance their own judgment with what the people want, especially when things are so, high stakes. It's a real tightrope walk.
No kidding. And as if things weren't complicated enough, right? Things start heating up around the world. Like Italy invades Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War breaks out, and Japan is getting really aggressive in China. It's like world peace went on vacation.
Totally. And all those events, they were more than just warning signs. They basically exposed, how flawed the Neutrality Acts actually were. And, they showed everyone that the U.S. military wasn't really prepared for a big global conflict.
It's like they'd hit the snooze button on military readiness. And Roosevelt was obviously super worried about all this. In one of his letters, he actually describes the situation in Europe as, quote-unquote, black. So he could see the danger, right? But he didn't really feel like he had the power to do anything about it.
Yeah, but Roosevelt was a pretty clever politician. He found a way to kind of slip around those Neutrality Acts. He found this thing called the cash and carry provision.
Oh, yeah. Clever loophole.
It basically allowed other countries to buy stuff from the U.S. as long as they paid in cash and, transported everything themselves. It was this kind of sneaky way to start helping the Allies. Without technically breaking the Neutrality Act.
Right, like he's playing 4D chess or something. And while all this is going on, the situation in Europe is getting worse. You have the rise of Hitler, right, and then the annexation of Austria, and then the Munich Agreement, which was, a disaster, and then finally the invasion of Poland. It's like all these dominoes falling one after another.
It really felt like the world was on the brink of chaos.
And then, bam! France falls to the Nazis in 1940, and that changes everything.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge turning point for Roosevelt and for American public opinion, too. Suddenly, the threat didn't feel so far away anymore.
Suddenly, it's right on their doorstep. And that brings us to a pivotal moment. The Lend-Lease Act. This is where America really ditches its isolationist stance.
Yeah, this is the big one. The Lend-Lease Act basically said, okay, we're in this fight. Even if we're not officially at war yet, it was a huge shift in policy. And it signaled that the U.S. was stepping up to help the Allies even before Pearl Harbor happened. I mean, the Lend-Lease Act was revolutionary. It allowed the president to just transfer or lease war materials to any country that was considered, quote, vital to the defense of the United States, end quote. It was huge. We're talking billions of dollars worth of aid going to Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allied nations.
Billions. It's mind-blowing. And to think all of this is happening while America is still officially neutral.
It really makes you wonder, right? Was Roosevelt like some mastermind who'd planned this all along? Was he carefully orchestrating America's entry into the war from the beginning? Or was he more reacting to events as they unfolded, just trying to find the best path forward in this crazy world?
It's a question that historians still debate today. Some argue that Roosevelt, he saw the danger of fascism early on and was skillfully, maneuvering the U.S. into a position to confront it.
Right.
But others say he was more reactive, adapting to events as they happened, and maybe even using those events to, kind of sway public opinion towards supporting the war.
It's like trying to read Roosevelt's mind. What did he really believe and what did he feel like he had to do given what was happening in the world? Tough question.
It really is. And our source, this history podcast, actually digs into some of the different schools of thought on this.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there's the traditional view, which paints Roosevelt as this visionary leader who saw the Nazi threat from the get-go. And then there's the revisionist view, which argues that he kind of nudged America into the war, maybe for economic or strategic reasons.
So two very different interpretations.
Exactly. And it shows just how complex this period in history really was. But this isn't just ancient history, right? These questions about leadership, public opinion, and how we deal with other countries, they're still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. The decisions leaders make have huge consequences, not just for their own countries, but for the whole world, really.
It's like we're looking through a time machine, using history to understand the challenges we face right now.
Exactly. History gives us this framework for understanding the world, how things are connected, how decisions get made, and how those decisions shape the course of history.
So, thinking about Roosevelt again, we see a leader trying to balance all these competing forces. He's got a nation still traumatized by World War I, clinging to neutrality. But at the same time, he's watching fascism rise and the very real threat it poses to democracy everywhere.
And let's not forget the Great Depression, right? The U.S. was still struggling to recover economically. And here's Roosevelt trying to prepare for a potential world war on top of everything else. Talk about pressure.
It's amazing, right? He had to be both a pragmatist, responding to the immediate fears of the American people, and a strategist, thinking about the long-term threats to global security.
And that's what makes Roosevelt such a fascinating figure. He was operating in a world full of uncertainty. He didn't have all the answers, but he somehow managed to guide the nation on a path that would eventually lead to the defeat of fascism.
You can question his methods, sure, but you can't deny the impact of his decisions. They changed the world.
Absolutely. His choices changed the course of history, not just for America, but for everyone. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Roosevelt's road to war, what are your thoughts? Knowing all this, the context, the pressures, the choices, what's your take on his actions? Given everything, do you think he made the right calls? It's a question worth thinking about. I mean, historians will probably be debating that for years to come. What I find most interesting is how much this period, how much it connects with what's going on in the world today. Like, how do leaders today face these kinds of dilemmas? How does public opinion shape decisions about foreign policy and stuff? These are questions that are still so relevant, even in the 21st century.
Totally. It's like history is talking to us, giving us these lessons we can use in our own lives.
Right. And that's why it's so important to study history. It's not just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding the forces that shape the world, the choices we make, and how those choices lead to consequences. It's a big deal.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's amazing how decisions made decades ago can still have these ripple effects today.
It makes you think about the weight of history and maybe even a sense of responsibility, to learn from the past, to engage with what's happening now, and to try to build a future where we don't repeat the same mistakes that led to these huge global conflicts.
Well said. This deep dive into Roosevelt's road to war has been quite a journey. We've explored the crazy challenges he faced, the decisions he made, and the lasting impact of those choices. And, we've seen how the historical context really shapes our understanding of it all.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to really dig into this.
So as we wrap things up here, what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to remember that leadership is rarely easy. It often involves making tough choices, balancing all these competing interests, and sometimes even going against what the public wants. And Roosevelt, he was dealing with a lot of pressure from all sides. People who wanted to stay out of the war, people who wanted to get involved, a public that was just exhausted from everything. And he somehow managed to find a path forward and ultimately led America into a war that, while it was incredibly costly, helped defeat fascism.
That's a great point, and I think another key takeaway is the power of understanding history. The choices made by leaders like Roosevelt had a massive impact on the world, and we're still dealing with those repercussions today. By understanding the historical context, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the challenges and complexities of our own time.
Absolutely. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it definitely rhymes. We can learn a lot from the past, even if those lessons aren't always clear-cut or easy to figure out. By studying history, we can sharpen our critical thinking skills, become more informed citizens, and maybe even find ways to avoid making the same mistakes that were made before.
Couldn't agree more. I think this deep dive has been a fantastic example of how history can really come alive and how relevant it still is to our world today. We've seen how a nation grappled with the whole isolationism versus intervention thing, how a leader navigated this super complex and constantly changing global landscape, and how the choices made back then still affect us now. It's mind-blowing, really.
It really is.
We encourage you to keep digging into this period in history. There's so much to learn. Explore the different viewpoints on Roosevelt's leadership. Think about the parallels between the challenges of the past and the ones we face today. And most importantly, keep asking questions, keep trying to understand. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we can learn from it and how we can use that knowledge to make the future better.
That's the goal.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it interesting and maybe even inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring the world with a curious mind and an open heart.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.